We've had a wonderful fall series looking at this topic of food from several disciplinary perspectives this fall. And tonight is our series closer, where we're going to look towards the future. How do we continue to sustainably feed a growing population on our finite planet? So our sustainability director, Rachael Murtaugh, who is also a biologist, is going to talk to us tonight about farming. And I will let her introduce herself. Please welcome Rachael Murtaugh.
So I want to thank all of you for coming out. I think we got kind of lucky that it's not blowing snow and like negative 20 degrees, so I'm pretty happy about that. So I've been here at Mount Mercy for a couple years now. I recognize some of the students' faces, so I'm happy about that too. I have a bachelor's degree from College in biology and environmental science, and then I continued into grad school in conservation biology. And I really got interested in sustainability growing up in rural Iowa, learning to love the environment and appreciate the diversity of the life around me beyond just myself and our own species. And then as I continued into college, kind of realizing how fragile those systems were and the impact that we are having on that environment. And it was kind of disheartening, but then as I continued in my career, realizing that each of us have our own power, we have our own agency, we can each do something to make change was really inspiring. And so I was excited to come here to Mount Mercy and work on sustainability. So I was very excited that the theme this year was going to be food. The theme for my office is also food, and who doesn't like to talk about food and eat it? Like, it's just a wonderful topic. So tonight we're going to kind of talk about our growing world, our growing population. How do we feed the billions of people that are going to be joining us over the next couple decades? Not just dealing with the population growth, but the population growth in the shadow of climate change. How do we continue to feed ourselves in a changing climate around the world? So talking about world population, we have this nice exponential growth curve here. If any of you are familiar with ecology, typically when populations show this type of curve, with this sudden spike in population, it's usually followed by a very short crash in population. And that's something we definitely don't want to see, because that means lives lost. So as the population booms and grows, we have to figure out how we're going to feed those people, but not just feed each generation, but how do we preserve resources for generations to come? One of the things we have to start considering is the greenhouse gas emissions emitted from our agricultural practices. So this is kind of a pie chart showing where greenhouse gas is coming from. So greenhouse gases are not just carbon dioxide, but things like methane, nitrous oxide, even water vapor can be considered a greenhouse gas. Of course, we immediately think of like fossil fuels and electricity, but a surprising amount of greenhouse emissions are coming from things like agriculture and how we're using our land and forestry. So agriculture, deforestation is a huge chunk of that section. So 24% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from how we're using our land. When we start to look at greenhouse emissions with food, we really can start narrowing in on some protein sources. So a lot of these graphs are coming from an article that was in Science magazine last year. It was one of the June issues. I found it particularly interesting, and so I've included a lot of the figures from that. So this is showing greenhouse gas emissions based on protein sources. So up here, you might have guessed, the kind of worst offender is beef. Darn. And what's interesting is they've broken it up into different parts of its production. So we have land use change. So that could be deforestation or conversion of a grassland to row crop or different things like that. We have the actual crop production itself. So that could be things like the emissions from tractors and combines, nitrous oxide from nitrogen fertilizer, that type of thing. And then you have the actual livestock itself. So, beef, they burp, and they belch and basically fart a lot of methane. And so do several of these other animals, produce a lot of methane, hogs especially. So actually, not as much as you might think. So it's interesting to look at where these different protein sources are emitting their greenhouse gas. So with beef, the actual livestock itself is doing quite a bit of work, but it also has a large land use effect as well. As you start to look at some other protein sources, if you look at hogs, the hog itself is not producing a lot of greenhouse gas, but producing the crops to feed all those hogs is really what's driving the greenhouse emissions for that protein source. So these are all animal protein sources. You can see some of the lower ones. Poultry is fairly low down. Don't just look at the bars, but look at the numbers on top there. And farmed fish is actually also very low. If you're looking at these lines here, these lines are interesting because the red line is the average greenhouse gas emission for non-animal sources. So legumes, nuts, that type of thing. And so many of these sources, the plant-based protein is much lower in greenhouse gas emission than the animal protein. There's that top one there, you'll see the gray line. Can we all see that gray line, kind of the top line? That is the average greenhouse emission if you exclude nuts. So the nice thing about nuts, we'll see, yes, nope, not in that one. We'll see in a later graph. Nuts are grown on trees, right? And what do trees do for carbon dioxide? They pull it into themselves and they sequester it. So the bulk of a tree, it's amazing to think, all of that came from carbon dioxide. All of that was made out of the gas floating in the air. And so the nuts actually can help sequester carbon dioxide, and they actually have a negative impact on greenhouse emissions, which is kind of neat to think about. So when we start looking at food beyond those protein sources, I know these are really small. I tried making it as big as possible. We can start looking at other food sources. And what's neat about this graph is it didn't just go with greenhouse emissions, but it looks at other environmental impacts as well. For example, acidification of soils, eutrophication of water. So that basically means reducing oxygen in the water. If you have a eutrophic environment, it means there's not a lot of oxygen, and you get areas like dead zones, which we'll talk about, where nothing can basically live in the water because there's not enough oxygen. The eutrophication is often caused by phosphorus, and that leads to algal growth, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then also, it talks about the scarcity of water. As we continue into climate change, water is going to become a very hot commodity. It's going to be very scarce in some places, and it's going to be overabundant in other places. And so water scarcity is definitely something we have to consider moving forward. Some of the interesting things on here, it also includes land use, is it starts looking at things like your oils, vegetables, fruits, and also different types of sugars. So with this graph, you can kind of look and see, okay, maybe I want to try to choose a more environmentally friendly type of sugar. We've got our sugars down here. We have cane sugar and we have beet sugar. And in all 5 of these cases, cane sugar has a much larger impact than sugar beets. So it's interesting to look at some of these environmental impacts, and it can help guide our choices to be more environmentally kind. It's the same with oil. So if you start looking at land use change, palm oil has less of an effect than soybean or olive oil. But it has a fairly high greenhouse gas emission. So you have to kind of start weighing the pros and cons there. In any of these cases, palm oil does get a bad rap because it does lead to several issues with deforestation. But you can find products that use sustainable palm oil, and that's definitely something to look for in any labeling if that's a concern of yours. When we're looking at the environmental impact of food, we can't just think about the animal or the land use or something like that. It's a whole process. And each step in the production of food has its own individual impact and its own opportunity to basically make it a healthier product for the planet and honestly for us as well. So from the land use, you can think of, instead of doing a slash and burn type of deforestation, maybe we can start introducing some forestry, which we'll talk about a little bit, where you are intermingling crops and livestock with a forest or a stand of trees. You can think about the production side of it, in being more responsible with the waste. With packaging, can we have less plastic in our packaging? Can we have compostable packaging? Can we have no packaging? So there's lots of different steps that we can start making improvements to make our food more sustainable and have less of an impact. This is an interesting graph because it starts to look at each of those steps in production. And I do have a little bit more blown up versions as we go on. So down here it's looking at all those steps that we just looked at. Land use change, crop production, livestock, so the actual animals, processing that product, transporting it, packaging it, the retail, and then also what I like is it includes losses. So what's the effect of the waste that's generated with that food? How much of that food is typically wasted? So, and I apologize for the weird color shift in here. It's a little blue. So I've kind of tried to blow this up, but I know it's a little fuzzy. I had to dig into the supplemental materials in the article for this one, but I thought it was a really interesting bit of information. So again, this is protein source. We'll go down into non-protein foods. But you can see, for example, with a lot of the animal proteins, it's the actual animal itself and the raising of the animal that is the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions. So what this graph is looking at, it's not looking at how much greenhouse gas is being emitted with each product, but at what stage is the most greenhouse gas being emitted. So for the animals, that yellow line is the actual growing of the animal. If we start to get down into, we have brown nuts, peas, and different legumes, pulses. This brown line is the crop production. So the actual farming of that produce is what's generating the greenhouse gas. And so this kind of shows us, okay, where in this line of production for this particular food can we have the biggest impact on reducing greenhouse emissions? So if we're looking at trying to reduce carbon emissions for growing peas or ground nuts, well then we want to focus on crop production, not so much the processing, because we're not going to have a ton of impact. We want to focus on the actual growing of the crop and reducing our impact that way. Losing my scarf. If we look at non-protein foods, we can start getting into fruits and vegetables. If we really want to have some fun, we can start looking at the beer and wine. And we have our oils up there. And so again, it's the same graph. Let's look at that palm oil. So again, even though palm oil had a smaller greenhouse footprint or carbon footprint, a large chunk of that footprint is due to land use change, so deforestation. So can we plant palm oil in a way that is preserving the forest around it, or can we intermingle native trees in with the plantation to reduce that carbon impact? If we look down here at the alcohols like beer and wine, the largest chunk is in the packaging. Packaging and retail, really. So how can we make the packaging part of that production have less of an impact? So this isn't a one solution will fit all foods. We have to look at where it's having an impact in order to solve and reduce its carbon emissions. So you might notice these negative bars here for land use change. If you can read it, I can barely read this, and I'm right next to it. These are all trees. So again, they're sequestering the carbon. And so we can have impacts in a positive way too through agriculture. So we're going to start looking, so we were kind of global, and now we're going to kind of start shrinking it down. So here's our US population as we go up from estimated in 1790 all the way up to 2010. We're going to be in, that's the last census. 2020 is our next census. Make sure to be counted. It goes into a lot of decisions you don't even think about, so make sure you answer the census. Little plug there. With the population growth, there was concern about hunger in America and how do we solve hunger? How do we reduce it? And it's a very noble goal, right? It's a very lofty goal. How do we end hunger in America? And there was one strategy that people thought would work. Okay, we're going to make agriculture and growing food more efficient, and that's going to solve all of our problems. And so what ended up happening is we had a big uptick in farming. Kind of, you can see this is kind of the colonizing of the West and plowing up of the prairie. So we had a big spike in farms. And then around the 20s, 30s, kind of the Depression era, a lot of farms went out of business. They got bought by larger farms that could survive. And so we started seeing this consolidation of farms. So we had a decrease in the number of farms and an increase in the farm size. And that trend really continued up until present day. And so the goal was, well, if we make these farms big and standardized, we consolidate them, we just grow one type of food and we can make it easy and we can mechanize it, we can streamline it. Basically what they tried to do is they tried to take a living organism and they tried to turn it into a machine. And so we now see that with our agricultural economy, a large portion of it is two major crops, corn and soybeans. We got some other ones in here. I think it's funny that they combine vegetables and melons. It's kind of like a weird combination. Anyway, not the point. The point is, we grow a lot of corn and we grow a lot of soybeans. If you go out anywhere around in Iowa, that's very apparent. So we wanted to mechanize, consolidate, and standardize our agriculture. And as people, we like that, right? We like order, we like simplicity. But it doesn't always work. Because when you do that, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket. You're putting your faith that those two major crops are going to actually be eaten. I don't know how many people actually go out and munch on a ear of field corn. I tried it once, about broke a tooth. But so when you really just grow a monoculture, when you grow one single crop, you leave yourself really vulnerable to several different things. You leave yourself vulnerable to weather. This year has been a great example of that, right? Like it was a super cold, wet spring. Farmers couldn't get out into the fields until very late. And then we had an early snow and a wet fall, and so it's been very difficult to harvest. We're behind on our harvest for both corn and soybeans. When farmers do harvest, it's not dry enough. The crop has to be dry or it's going to mold and rot in storage. And so we're having to use fossil fuel. We're having to emit more greenhouse gas to dry that crop. And so we're very vulnerable to weather. That plays into the vulnerability of seasonal changes. So tricky thing with climate change is that it's going to be changing the timing of our seasons. And so when you grow just one type of crop, it really likes to have standardized seasons and predictability. What's happening with climate change? A lack of predictability. It makes it very challenging. But you also have opened yourself up to disease. We've seen this with several crops. For example, the papaya in Hawaii. They grew one type of papaya in Hawaii, and a fungus came through and wiped out the entire state's crop. Thanks to a little bit of genetic engineering, they were able to modify the papaya to be fungal resistant, and that's basically the papaya that we eat now. It's the same with bananas. We have one type of banana, exclude plantains. They're different. Our eating bananas are one species and they're seedless, so they don't really reproduce very well. They're basically clones. So that's opening up to disease, right? You can't have any evolution within that food crop because you're not giving it any option to evolve, and so we leave it vulnerable to disease. But you're also susceptible to changes in the market, changes in the world market. We're seeing that also, right now with our trade with other countries. We're not sending out as many soybeans as we thought we might. And so when you only grow one crop, you're very vulnerable to the flux of the changing market and changing politics. Another issue with growing only one or two crops is you have to standardize that crop's environment. If you try to grow it everywhere, you have to make everywhere the same. And so farmers are spending more and more money on standardizing their soils. So they're spending money on fertilizer, on changing the pH of the soil, on soil conditioning. And so we kind of see this increase in farmers spending just to try to be able to grow that one type of crop, because we're growing it in places that maybe we shouldn't. This graph is a little funny because it looks like spending went down, right? If you look at it, it's like the darker the color, the more money has been spent. It looks lighter over here. But if you look at the scale, they had to change the scale. So here, the highest that they had is 12 or more, and here they shifted it to 18 or more. So it's a little bit deceiving if you just look at the color. So farmers are spending more money to try to grow the same crop in just over 5 years. Why are we having to change all our soils if our soils are so rich? Another issue is when you have a large monocrop, leaving it open to disease, to pests. You're trying to squeeze as many bushels of corn out of an acre as you can. You don't want to deal with pigweed or buttonweed or whatever you're trying to get rid of. And so we spray it with chemicals to try to standardize and make harvest easier. So we're looking at glyphosate. Glyphosate is Roundup. If you've noticed, it's been in the news a lot lately with lawsuits, with health issues. We're finding now that it sticks around in the environment much, much longer than we ever thought it did. And we're finding now even that exposure to Roundup is changing the microbiome within our soil. So it's changing the diversity of bacteria in our soil that is responsible for the cycling of nutrients. So we're disrupting what makes our soil so valuable by spraying it with Roundup. And we can see that in just over 10 years, it basically went up by, goodness, how many fold is that? It went from usually just 4 to 21 to many areas being 88 pounds or more glyphosate per square mile. That's a lot of Roundup. So we're spraying our fields with more and more chemicals. We cannot keep doing this. And does anyone have an idea of why we have to keep spraying more? Anyone have an idea?
Resistance.
Exactly. Evolution is an amazing thing. It really is, until it means that you have to keep spraying more Roundup. It's a similar idea to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The weeds when you add a chemical like a pesticide, an herbicide, you're basically giving it a selection pressure. So you are selecting, you're acting as nature, and you're selecting for the varieties, that one weed that has a weird mutation that allows it to survive that Roundup spray, and that is the only weed that survives to reproduce, and suddenly you have a field full of Roundup-resistant pigweed. So we have to spray more and more to kill those, and they keep getting stronger and evolving. So with all of this money spent on soil conditioning and chemicals and spraying and fertilizers, are we actually feeding people? And the information that we're getting is, the answer is no, we're not. What we're doing is we're feeding a lot of livestock. We're making a lot of ethanol. We're making other products that I can't even think about what we make out of corn and soybeans, but we're not feeding people. So this is the value per farm of agriculture sold to individuals, and you can see, this area here where we had all those chemicals sprayed, where we have all the fertilizer. This is also like some of the richest soil in the world. It's called black gold for a reason. But we're not feeding people out of this rich natural resource. What are we doing with it? And why are we farming the way we're farming? We could have a big discussion about policy and politics around that, but we'll skip over that for a while. So we used to actually grow quite a bit of our own food here in Iowa. A lot of the produce that was eaten in Iowa used to be grown in Iowa, pre-World War II, really. So in the 1920s, we could see about, there was a much larger variety of crops being grown. And these were crops that ranged from apples and grapes all the way, down to carrots and potatoes, actual food that you might see in the grocery store. We were growing it here locally, and we were eating it locally. So the whole idea of eating local is not a new concept. We're going back to the old concept because that's what was working. This is another interesting thing, because I was saying, are we really feeding people? Not really. 54.5% of the U.S. corn crop goes to feed livestock. So if we wanted to start really feeding people, then maybe we feed livestock just a little bit less. So the goal with all of this mechanization, the standardization, the spraying, the soil conditioning, the growing of soybean and corn, the goal was to try to reduce hunger. We have not succeeded. We've actually seen hunger increase. If any of you came to John Ickert's talk, this was kind of taken from conversations with him. Really interesting person to talk to. In 1968, it was estimated, it's difficult to estimate, but it was estimated that only about 1 in 20, or only 5% of our population suffered from food insecurity. Now in 2019, we're more than double that. 11% of our population, 1 in 8 people, are struggling with food insecurity and not knowing where they're going to eat tomorrow. So with all of this effort and all the standardization, we have not reached our goal of reducing hunger. We've increased it. We've increased it because we're using our fertile land to grow food for animals and ethanol and not for people. And it has its other consequences as well. If any of you saw my talk on Iowa lands and waters last year, some of these slides will look familiar, but they connect. They just connect. So with a lot of this standardization, this mechanization, these row crops, we have severe consequences for our fertile soil, and that's erosion. So in Iowa, we're basically losing 5 to 7 tons per acre per year of topsoil. That is 40% above what the soil can regenerate. You don't regenerate soil overnight. It takes hundreds of years to build up that thick layer of topsoil that we see here in Iowa. Imagine this is like, your bank account. If you're taking out $100 every day, but you're only putting 60 back in, you're going to run out of money pretty quick, right? It's the same with our soil. Our soil is running out. When I was in Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, there was this huge cornfield, and in the middle of the cornfield was an old pioneer cemetery. And because it was a cemetery, it could not be plowed over. So it was protected. And it was this tiny little remnant prairie in the middle of a cornfield. And I kid you not, the prairie was 2 feet higher than the cornfield. Because the corn had eroded 2 feet worth of soil in less than 100 years. That's not sustainable. And erosion causes other problems. It causes sediment in our water. So sediment in water is what leads to an uptick in phosphorus, so that eutrophication I was talking about. Algae is basically, it's a plant, and it loves phosphorus and nitrogen, just like your lawn, just like your flowers, like Miracle-Gro. Phosphorus and nitrogen, that's basically what it is. So when you increase the amount of phosphorus and also increase the amount of nitrogen from nitrogen fertilizers in the water, you get this lovely, lovely green scum. How many of you have seen a pond with the lovely green scum? Yeah. So these algal blooms are not natural. They're not normal. And in several cases, if you get a bloom of particular species, you get toxic algal blooms. So we've actually had people get sick in Iowa. My niece actually was hospitalized because they went swimming in a lake and they thought the lake was safe, but they missed the notification of an algal bloom and the water was actually toxic. And she is 2 years old and swallowed some of the lake water and was hospitalized because of algal toxins. So we're poisoning our water basically by fertilizing is what we're doing. But sediment has other issues. Several species require a certain amount of clarity in the water to either breathe, breed, or eat. Those are all very important things for life, right? And so as we increase sediment in our water, we actually are causing extinction of several of our freshwater species as well. So here's kind of a map of Iowa and its impacted waters from 2016. The DNR has people that go out and they sample a lot of these streams, usually on a 5-year basis. So they try to reach all these streams within a 5-year rotation. Cedar Rapids is here, I think. So you can see our Cedar River is lovely and impacted pretty severely. So red is a higher impact than yellow. And so we can see that in Iowa we have several impacted streams, and we may have more impacted streams than not. And all of this eventually ends up into the Gulf of Mexico. So we are within the Mississippi River watershed. All of the rain that hits Iowa ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. We're all connected, like the Lion King. And so when we have phosphorus and nitrates from fertilizers and sediment erosion going into the water, it eventually makes it downstream to the Gulf of Mexico. And what happens is all of that fertilizer causes a massive algal bloom, just like that green scum. And that algae grows and grows and grows throughout the growing season, and then come about midsummer, the flow of nutrients stops. And the algae can't grow anymore until they die. When the algae dies, it gets decomposed by bacteria in the water as it settles down to the benthic layer, to the bottom of the ocean. And just like us, bacteria need oxygen to eat and degrade that algae. So as they're digesting that dead algae, they use up all the oxygen in the water. And so we get the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. So basically, if you look worldwide, this is not a unique thing. Every single large river that meets the ocean, if it has agriculture along it, it has a dead zone. The Gulf of Mexico is one of the biggest in the world, but it's definitely not alone. It's predicted, based on the amount of fertilizer flushed out of the Mississippi this year, that the dead zone will be over 7,000 square miles, roughly the size of Massachusetts. That's huge. Last year it was the size of New Jersey. So we're down a little bit, but not because of anything we've done. Usually the size of the dead zone fluctuates depending on the amount of rain. So if we have a ton of rain up here, that's flushing all the fertilizer down the Mississippi, we have a bigger dead zone. 2012 was the smallest dead zone we've seen in a decade. Does anyone remember something special about 2012? It was a drought. No rain, no fertilizer washed into the river, we had a smaller dead zone. So there is a task force, and there's lots of efforts being done within the states, within Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, to try to keep fertilizer, keep nutrients and soil on the land, out of the water. And we are making really good progress, we're just not seeing the effects yet. And that can be really discouraging. I went to a conference where they were talking about this, and that was one of the questions raised is, why are we putting in all of this effort, and farmers are putting in all of this effort to try to reduce their impact, but we're not seeing the results? And they had a really interesting solution. So not all of the algae that dies every year gets eaten every year. So there's kind of this buildup of dead algae at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. And so we have kind of this debt that we have to work through before we start to see a real decrease in the dead zone size. So we're trying to not be discouraged by the fact we haven't seen a big impact. We know we're having an impact. It may just be several years and maybe decades before we actually see the dead zone shrink. Nothing in the environment is short term. That's the thing. Sustainability, ecology, all of this is a long-term goal. And so we can't be discouraged when we don't see immediate results. So going back, thinking about in Iowa, we have this rich soil. Why are we not producing food for people? A lot of people are starting to think that, and they're asking that, and they're questioning that. And so there's this surge in the local food movement, right? You see all these little catchphrases, eat local, farmers markets are popping up all over the place. One thing I love about Cedar Rapids is during the growing season, I think there's only one day a week that there's not a farmer's market somewhere. I think like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, there's one in Knowledge Park. On Thursdays, Matthew 25 has their Cultivate Hope Farmers Market. On Saturdays, there's the Cedar Rapids or the Marion Farmers Market. And on Sunday, there's a farmers market in Hiawatha. So basically, the only day that you don't have a farmers market is Tuesday. Nobody likes Tuesday anyway, so it's fine. It's like the most pointless day of the week. So we should have a farmers market, because then it would have a purpose. Yeah, okay. So there's a big surge in the desire to have local food. And in Iowa, we could meet a lot of that demand. Sorry, I'm moving ahead of my notes here. And I'm about to get to some numbers that I couldn't memorize, so I'm going to have to look at them. There we go. So in Iowa, we have a desire for some of these foods. So if you look, this is the difference between the amount of food we grow and the demand for certain product. Of course, sweet corn, we make more than we want to eat, right? So like during the summer, every time I go to Chicago, my mother-in-law says, bring me some Iowa sweet corn. I'm like, it's really not unique. You can get it anywhere in the Midwest, but she is dead certain that there's something special about Iowa sweet corn. I'm not going to tell her any different. But several of these crops we could grow a lot here. So we import a crazy amount of our cucumbers, 92%, versus from the deficit for the demand and what we produce. I don't know how many of you plant cucumbers in your yard, but you don't need a lot of plants. If you plant more than like 3 cucumbers, unless you're pickling, you're going to have cucumbers coming out your ears. Like, it's insane. So in Iowa, we do have a really good climate for several of these products. So we could really boost our local food production. In the same, just if we look at the U.S. overall, what's interesting is how much of our food we export instead of eating it here locally. For example, look at our poultry. Why are we importing that much when we are exporting that much? That makes no sense to me. Why don't we just eat a portion of what we're exporting? And it all comes down to, well, exporting, we can get more money for it, or something like that. It's the same for a lot of this, for some non-meats. For example, apples. Why are we importing apples when we're exporting, almost 5 times more? Why are we not eating that produce here in the U.S.? And that's actually basically the same. We export more than we import, except, what is that, tomatoes. We import a lot of tomatoes. But again, we can grow a lot of tomatoes. Anyone just get overwhelmed with cherry tomatoes if you plant more than 2 plants? Yeah,
My husband planted 3 plants for spring because I love tomatoes in my salad, and it's like every 3 days, eat your tomatoes.
There's just a bowl sitting on your counter. Yeah.
Pretty much.
Staring at you
Yeah.
with little red eye. Yeah. So we have a ton of potential to grow food here in the U.S. instead of importing it. And that all comes down to food security. Because as we have these tentative trade relationships, if we grow more of our own food here locally, we eat it locally, we are securing our national interest and our own population with its own food. Again, we could grow what we want to eat. So this is the same graph that we saw. I just think it's a really interesting to look at these 37 products. And so these are the kind of the same here. They're similar. And there was a study, these are some of the numbers that I can't remember, so I have to look at it. So there was a 2005 study that found that in Iowa, if we converted 15,000 acres to growing these 37 crops, I don't know why okra's in there, but those 37 crops only to reach 25% of the demand. So that's not reaching all the demand. It would equivalent to 2,031 new jobs, $54 million of income in labor, and farms would make $99 million in direct sales. And that's selling directly to people. Now, if you put the middleman in there of a grocery store like Hy-Vee or Fairway or whatever, it changes it, but it still is 1,183 jobs created, $33.5 million made in labor, and the farmer is still making $99 million in sales. So if we start really investing in local farmers, we can really have a nice boost to our state economy as well. But then we still have to get over this. We have to get over this barrier of how do we keep this production going, not just for this generation or the next generation, but for 4, 5, 6 generations down the line and beyond. Because we've degraded our soil, right? Like that 2 feet of soil, that's a lot lost. So how do we rebuild? We're now in the state of, yes, we need to conserve, but we also need to rebuild our state's most valuable resource, really. And here's where we get into this idea of regenerative agriculture. So instead of just growing food that's sucking resources out of the planet, how do we grow food so that we're really putting them back into the soil, that we're investing in the future of agriculture? And this is where this idea of agroecology or regenerative agriculture comes into play. The idea with agroecology is to grow in a way that mimics nature or that works with nature instead of fighting against her. Because I think, as we've seen, not just this year, but years past, nature always wins. She's not particularly kind in some ways, and she always wins. So we have to start working with her instead of trying to fight against her. It's the same with water. Water always wins. So with agroecology and working with nature, we can actually start seeing an increase in biodiversity of our farms. That's including crops, but also wild plants, pollinators, and other wildlife. We see an increase in biodiversity, and whenever you increase biodiversity, you strengthen the ecosystem and you make it more stable. And I think what we like as human beings is stability. But we also start to enrich the soils. So we start to build that soil back up. We introduce more carbon into the soils. We start to fix the nutrient cycling within the soils. And because we're taking care of the soils, we automatically start taking care of our water. So decreasing the amount of fertilizer running off into those streams, less algal blooms, less dead zones. We improve the watersheds. All of this really equates into our ecosystem services. So the things that the ecosystem is doing for us, like nutrient cycling, water filtration, pollinating. Pollinating is one of the most essential essences of agriculture that we take for granted. 1 out of every 4 bites of food that you eat is solely dependent on a pollinator. Not just honeybees. Native bees are actually much better at pollinating than honeybees, and so we need to protect our native pollinators. And because you're enriching the soil, you're increasing biodiversity, you're strengthening the stability, we can actually start to see increase in food yields with regenerative agriculture, which is something we desperately need as we have a growing population, we have a growing number of people who are food insecure. These large monocultures, these large standardized cultures is not increasing food yield. We need to actually start working on a process that does. And then one of the biggest things, climate resistance. If you have a more stable ecosystem, you have a soil that can really absorb moisture and hold on to it, then you have a soil that can deal with flood, you can deal with drought. And then also, the nice thing that I think is often overlooked when it comes to food is one of the key aspects of agroecology is it's respecting cultures and respecting ancestral knowledge of those cultures. For example, cultures in, say, Southern Africa, that environment is not supposed to grow corn. But Western culture has moved in and told those people, you should be growing corn, because we grow corn. But increasing corn yields in South Africa has led to drought, deforestation, soil erosion, poverty, and also increase in famine. Now, what if we allowed those groups of people in those cultures to go back to their ancestral agriculture and growing food that was drought resistant, food that was more stable in that climate? And we respected the fact that those people have been there for centuries, eons. They know what works in their environment and respecting that culture for what it does know. And learning from them, really. Some of the ways that agroecology does this, they do no-till or minimal tilling, so they're not disturbing the soil. Composting is huge, so by composting you reintroduce carbon and nutrients back into the soil. Not spraying pesticides, so much of this is organic. And then also integrating animals into plant production. So I worked on a vegetable farm my first summer of grad school. Best job of my life. I ate very well, because every potato that I speared by accident, I got to take home. Same with other things. But the farmer that I worked with allowed his chickens to basically roam the entire farm, because they're really good pest control. They left the plants alone, but what they did is they picked off all the little caterpillars that were eating his cabbages, the tomato worms that were munching on the tomato leaves, the cucumber beetles that were eating his cucumbers. And so when you start to integrate animals into your system, you're mimicking nature, right? Because an environment has both plants and animals working together. And so as we introduce livestock into our produce production, we can actually see a more cyclical environment happening. Another interesting thing is perennial crops. So instead of having to plant something every single season, what if that crop stayed in the ground and grew year after year? Wheat, the ancestor of wheat actually was perennial. And so there's a lot of research going into trying to make wheat a perennial crop again. And so it can develop a deep root system like old prairie. And we don't have to keep tilling and reseeding, but we can just harvest from the wheat year after year. Really interesting research there. Pollinator protection is key. So reintroducing pollinator habitat and protecting native pollinators is really key to any of this. And then companion planting. So this is the concept where you plant plants together that grow well together, or even grow better when they grow together. So if you go downstairs and go that way, there's 3 raised beds. Those are kind of our campus vegetable gardens. And whenever I'm planning, I literally go in. If you have a garden at home, I highly recommend going to Mother Earth News Garden Planner. It's super fun. But it will help you companion plant, basically. So, for example, tomatoes grow really well when they're next to onions. They do not grow well when they're next to cucumbers. And so you can kind of plant things strategically so that you are able to use less fertilizer, you're able to use less water. They may have a better taste. So growing basil next to your tomatoes actually increases the flavor of your tomatoes. So companion planting can be really key. Also, you can companion plant for pest control. So like in this picture, they have marigolds planted throughout their vegetables. Marigolds are great for keeping away certain pests like nematodes and cucumber beetles, of all things. So companion planting is key. Cover crops. This is the idea that over the winter, when you aren't growing your main crop, you have something like alfalfa or a legume growing on the surface to protect the soil and reintroduce nitrogen into the soil for next year's crop. Crop rotation is also key, so not growing the same thing in the same place year after year. When you grow the same plant in the same place, you're increasing your risk of disease and you're stripping the soil of nutrients faster. So rotating crops is also key. And then this is that whole idea of respecting culture. It has to be place-based. Not every plant grows everywhere perfectly. So really paying attention to your climate, paying attention to your environmental conditions, and growing the food that wants to grow there, instead of forcing something to grow there that doesn't really want to. A great example of this is actually right here in Cedar Rapids. So Indian Creek Nature Center was gifted a 192-acre farm from George Etzel in 2016. And this, they've partnered with the Rodell Institute. So the Rodell Institute is a research organization that is focusing on regenerative agriculture research. So getting the data, getting the science behind this process so that it doesn't just feel like a fluff piece. Because it can, right? It can feel kind of hippy-dippy and like, oh, it's regenerative. It's beautiful. You know, having the data, having the facts. And so this farm is going to be basically a research farm for organic regenerative agriculture. They're going to be looking for volunteers throughout the year. So if you're interested in this type of stuff, you can definitely contact Indian Creek Nature Center and get out there and do some good work for this type of activity. Another opportunity to increase our food production is aquaculture. So it's, again, here's some more numbers that I can't remember, so I'm going to have to look them up. Here we go. So it's estimated that by 2030, the global demand for seafood is going to increase by 100 to 170 billion pounds. And wild stocks cannot keep up. Wild stocks cannot keep up with the current demand as we start to see fisheries crash and species are crashing because we're overfishing. And so aquaculture is really going to be key, but we have to do it responsibly. Because farm fish, although they have a low land use and they have a low acidity, they do have an effect on eutrophication, so increased phosphorus use. It's the same for crustaceans. Crustaceans have a pretty high greenhouse gas emission, and so we have to start doing it responsibly because we're going to see more and more aquaculture. And surprisingly, you wouldn't think about it, but we can grow seafood here in Iowa. Weird. Some of the big seafood crops here in Iowa is shrimp, and I guess tilapia is freshwater, right? And so is barramundi, but barramundi and tilapia are also very popular. One of the nice things about growing a saltwater species instead of a freshwater species is you have less risk of the fish getting loose, basically, and invading native streams. We have, so in Ridgeway, Iowa, there's a shrimp farm. And what's interesting is they didn't go out and use up land to build their facility. They used an abandoned building that was already there. So they're actually based in an old elementary school. So they have all their shrimp tanks in like the cafeteria and the gymnasium and the kindergarten room, and they're growing Pacific white shrimp there. And they actually are working on reducing their phosphorus impact because they use something called biofloc technique, where instead of the wastewater from the shrimp going out into a filter system, bacteria in the tank eat the waste and then the shrimp eat the bacteria, and it's this nice little cycle. And then they have a zero water exchange, again, so no wastewater is leaving the facility to pollute streams and rivers. Urban farming, we're also seeing an increase in things like hydroponics. So hydroponics is becoming popular as a way to use old warehouses. So converting these old abandoned warehouses into a hydroponic system and facility is a growing trend. Rooftop gardens are also getting bigger. One of the biggest in the country is in Boston, on the Boston Design Center. It's 40,000 square feet. And rooftop gardens have another added benefit. They actually can reduce heating and cooling costs for that building, and it reduces stormwater runoff, so you're improving water quality as well. And then a lot of cities are selling vacant lots to neighborhoods for cheap, for community gardens. And this is a beautiful way to get people connected to their food again and connected to each other, because we all like to come around the dinner table for food, right? And we can all come together for food production. Another great local example is Matthews 25 Cultivating Hope Farm. So this is down just on the northwest side on G Avenue. I drive by it every day on my way to work, and I love that. Their farmers market is Thursdays, 4 to 7 p.m. Their money all goes back to the nonprofit to help people in low income be able to afford good food and housing. And what's nice is they're also able to accept SNAP and WIC and EBT. And they have a nice other program, the Farm Fresh Friends program, where they sell their produce at half price to people who qualify income. So low-income families can now afford fresh, local produce that's grown organically. So I was like, the beginning was kind of doom and gloom, right? Now we're talking about, there's some good things happening locally to solve these problems. So we have some pathways forward. How can we get to that 15,000 acre mark, right, to feed 25% of our Iowa demand? There's lots of different things that we could do. A lot of this comes down to legislation and local action. For example, what if we had a cost share program to help farmers make that transition? Because I grew up in a rural community, and although we grew a lot of our own food growing up. I was very fortunate that way. And we grew up around a lot of farmers, and I know farmers to be very proud, independent people that love their land, they love what they do, and they genuinely want to feed people. So what if we actually allowed them to do that? It's very difficult because they're trapped in a system that keeps them in debt and keeps them growing corn and soybeans. So what if we helped them transition to growing something they actually want to grow, and that's food, actual food for people? So what if we did a cost share program? Or maybe we gave them a little bit of a tax relief with their property taxes as they're transitioning. Because a lot of these practices, they may take 4 to 10 years to start seeing the benefits. So we need to help them along and ease the burden as they make that transition. And then we have to develop local networks. How do we get the food from the farmer to the grocery stores, to the people? We need to start developing these marketing networks and ways to get the produce out. And one way that can really start is if our larger state institutions and companies started demanding some of this local produce. If we increase the demand, we will increase the supply. If there's a demand for it, we'll find a way to supply it. And then also, how many of you are members of the CSA? Is anyone in the CSA? A couple. I'm actually hoping to try this summer. One of my coworkers and I are going to do a half share and try it out together. I'm pretty excited. Not everybody can afford all that money up front. Because a CSA, you pay the money up front to support the farmer in case it's a bad year, and you're partnering with the farmer with the CSA. What if we could subsidize CSA for lower income families? So lower income families could actually participate in local food and get healthy food for their families instead of having their food benefits going towards, basically corn subsidized food like Cheetos and soda. What if we could actually help them afford a healthy lifestyle and healthy food? So the sustainability of agriculture, we have a lot of problems, but we have the tools for solution. We know what we need to do. There's the data to back it up. We just need the legislative power to do it. We need the local grassroots movement to really rise up and demand that we make this change. And maybe we can start working on some of these pathways forward to helping not just Iowa and the US, but worldwide start to regenerate our agriculture so we can keep growing real food for future generations. So, thank you. Questions, thoughts?
So what advice would you have for an individual? I would like to eat to reduce my environmental impact. So 2 or 3 things you would say, do this, this, and this.
Now I really wish I'd put up a certain graph. So I read another article that was really interesting that's what it was getting at is to look through all of that information, all those graphs could be very overwhelming. So what's kind of a good rule of thumb that people can work with? One thing I would say is to find a local co-op, because those co-ops are kind of doing a lot of the homework for you. So for example, like New Pioneer, they look at all of the products that they're selling to make sure that they are clean, sustainable. They do all the background checks of the labeling for you. But a nice rule of thumb is if it's healthy for you, it's probably healthier for the environment. So this article that I read looked at things like olive oil, fish, beef, different food items. What they found is a general trend, it wasn't perfect, but a general trend that if a food increased your mortality risk, so if it wasn't good for your health, it also had an increased environmental impact. So a kind of nice rule of thumb is if you want to eat healthy for the planet, eat healthy for you too. So decreasing our meat consumption, increasing our plant-based consumption really helps not just us, but also the planet. Yeah, it was a kind of nice chart. Yeah.
We've not lived in Cedar Rapids longest, 13 or so years, so we're still kind of new to the community. But over the years, my wife has, and I've helped sort of turn our yard into edible landscaping. And so we get strawberries late in May, and we get raspberries into late October, early November. And in between, we have lots of other fruiting plants. We also have small raised beds and are able to raise really quite a volume of vegetables on very little bit of land. So that would be maybe an alternative for some people, is rather than lawn, you just turn your yard into a garden.
Yeah, and that's kind of also another portion of the agroecology thing is instead of, a lawn is kind of wasted space. And lawns always kind of confuse me, right? You fertilize it, you water it to grow the grass, but then you cut the grass because you don't want it to grow too much. It seems you're constantly fighting the grass. And so, I completely, turning your space into a functional space, like an edible landscape, is a brilliant way to become more self-sustainable. And there are lots of wonderful tools and guidelines and kind of manuals to help you do that. And you can really make some of this edible landscaping really beautiful and artistic. One of the things, my husband and I are kind of starting the house hunt again, and I've yet to get him fully on board, but I'm going to do it anyway, is basically ripping out whatever landscaping we have, because I guarantee you it's all hostas, wherever we end up buying, and really increasing the amount of native plants in there and also doing a lot of edible landscaping. Because there are even a lot of native plants that are edible, like elderberries, chokecherries, and things like that. So, great comment.
So, as we saw in the graphs, beef is by far the largest greenhouse emissions Do you think in the future we're gonna need to like majorly increase the amount of meat we produce for pipeline?
Yeah, there's a lot of other things that we really need to work on. Cutting out beef is not the silver bullet. But when it comes to climate change, cutting out beef, yeah, it would help. But reducing the amount of beef that we eat has a much bigger impact on our ability to feed other people. So a lot of our land is used to feed cattle. So if we started using our land to feed people, we could really have a much greater impact, not just on climate change, but on world hunger as well. Also thinking of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, cattle are not always raised on pasture. Well, we have CAFOs, but there was already talk about CAFOs. But if you look down at Brazil, Brazil produces a ton of beef. But they do it by deforestation of their rainforest. So it's not just the cows emitting carbon dioxide, but as soon as you cut down a tree, you're emitting greenhouse gas, not only with the burning of the forest, but that tree is no longer able to sequester carbon for long-term storage. So yeah, that's another way that beef is affecting climate. Which is a shame, because I really like a good steak. Flank steaks. I love flank steak. So.
Do you know if they're still doing the destroying of overproduction? I remember seeing pictures of a huge mountain of bucket getting plowed, tomatoes getting plowed over, just so they can, because they had overproduced and they wanted to stabilize
The market.
For profit, they wanted to stabilize the market instead of, shipping it off to Africa or where India, where people are hungry.
I don't know for sure, but my pessimistic side is saying probably.
Yeah.
So, and there is a demand to stop that. So maybe on the large scale it's still happening, but there are small movements to prevent that kind of thing. So, like local grocery stores, if they have an oversupply of a certain produce, instead of throwing it out, it's getting donated to food pantries or shelters. Or if the food spoils, instead of it going to a landfill, for example, Hy-Vee composts a lot of its produce, and even a lot of its meat that goes bad. If you have an industrial composter, you can compost meat and fat and things like that. And so grocery stores are starting to really take a stand on food waste and turning it into a useful soil again, instead of letting it just emit greenhouse gas in the landfill. But that is an issue. Like, if we have all this extra food, how do we get it to people in need instead of just letting it rot, basically? Yeah. Did you have something?
Oh, I was going to say that I come from a big farming background and I live out in the country where it's like, farm,
Yep.
farm.
Corn,
And
beans, corn. Yeah.
Exactly, and I have uncles that have big farms, so we're out by the Benton County area, best friend, high school, big farming community. Would you say that farming, there's a great deal of demand for them, such as there's not as many farmers there is now these days as it was versus 10, 20 years ago?
So are you asking, is there a demand for farmers?
Yeah.
There is
Farming industry doing
Yeah.
crops and beans. 'Cause-
Yeah, well, and that's another interesting thing of when we consolidated all these farms, what we basically did was we robbed our rural communities of their economy. Because when you had, 10 to 20 smaller farms producing food commodities, producing food that could be actually sold in the towns itself, you actually had kind of this self-sustaining economy. And then as we move to these large-scale corn and beans, which you're not going to sell to your local community, you're going to sell to China or Brazil. you sucked the economy out of that rural community and the community dies. So not only can we, if we start to invest in local food production, not only are we feeding our local communities, but we get this rural resurgence in rural economy as well. And so yeah, there is a demand for farmer startups again. And that's when we have to kind of start doing maybe some of these ways forward. Can we do like maybe can we have a government insured loan for a farm startup, for a young farmer who wants to, take a shot at growing food, actual food, instead of maybe starting a hog confinement or something like that. And so yeah, I say we need more young farmers coming into the economy to grow not subsidized commodity crops, but growing actual food. Yeah.
Well, starting a farm, he said, it's usually family tradition. Passed down, like grandfather passed down this son passed down to this son, so on and so forth. Maybe you would actually go out there and start a farm if they're your abilities, or you just you inherit it basically. That's how. Yeah,
because land is so expensive. That's one of the biggest barriers. And so what if we did have kind of some of this cost share program? What if we had that government insured loan to purchase the land and to start actually a farming business there? I think it's going to take that because that money to get the land is one of the biggest barriers. And if you're coming from a non-farming background where you didn't grow up with it in your blood, that's very intimidating because what if for the first 5 years you just flounder and you don't succeed at all, then you're in debt and you're bankrupt and you fail. How do we cushion that learning curve for new farmers? I think that's going to be really key. Rhode Island's actually doing stuff like that. Yeah.
I think just kind of commenting, a lot of these solutions require some sort of political intervention or legislation. And not to be too discouraging, but one of the headlines today is that 700,000 people are set to lose their SNAP benefits.
Yeah. I was just listening to that on Marketplace.
And the other headline is that the Cedar Rapids City Council has downvoted 2 times to tear up a pollinator section to put in a rail yard. And so, to some extent, we're seeing our policies actually doing the opposite of what this is asking for. And I guess my comment is that as citizens, we need to understand this stuff, and we need to participate in our democracy. And we need to pressure our leaders to make sure that Americans believe that.
Exactly. So people get discouraged when it comes to voting. So like, well, nothing ever changes. But if you refuse to vote and you give up your vote, what you're allowing is you're allowing someone else to decide your future. So you're allowing someone else to vote for you, basically, by not voting. And so yes, we have to basically demand that our leaders start to make some of these legislative changes. But also, what's stopping some of us from becoming one of those leaders? From running for office? I don't think I have the personality for it because I don't tolerate BS very well. So I would not be tactful enough, I don't think. I think things would get held against me. But like, not just pressuring our leaders, but what if we had these new leaders coming in with some of these ideas, with some of these grassroots ideas, and really push the legislation themselves too. Most of this is going to take political legislative action. But some things like subsidizing CSAs or cost sharing, the state institution and local companies, that could be done by some grassroots movements that would not require political action, I think. Nonprofits. Yeah.
Joey mentioned city councils in the process of turning a 25-plus acre plot that's devoted to pollinators into a rail yard for
in the flood zone.
A large agribusiness company here. There's one more reading. 4 o'clock on the 17th of December. So a lot of us have been showing up and commenting about that. And so if some of you were to show up and be fresh faces and fresh voices, might be able to get them to at least postpone or back off the rezoning, which is the issue. As a matter of fact,
Yeah.
a woman about your age from Co., I think she teaches biology, came and gave some expert testimony, if you will, in the 5 minutes that you're allotted. So, not to put you on the spot, but if you were to show up with the depth and breadth of knowledge that you have and commitment you have to locally grown and sustainable agriculture and the importance of pollinators, you might be able to contribute quite a lot. So.
Yeah, I don't think my emails did very much, so maybe I do need to show up. And yeah, another issue with that, not only are they tearing up a pollinator place, but it's within the floodplain. So if our goal is to reduce the risk of flooding in the years to come, which with climate change, our area is expected to see increased number of large rain events. So we are at an increased risk of flooding and an increased risk of drought. I know they seem to go opposite with each other, but they go hand in hand. And so it makes no sense that we're building in the floodplain and that we are reducing the amount of infiltration that our floodplain could have. Because if you do a rail yard, you're not going to get water infiltrating into the soil. You're going to increase flooding by disrupting that soil. So it makes no sense to me for them. If their goal is to decrease flooding and increase the sustainability of our city, why are we disrupting pollinator habitat? I don't know.
So I think Rachel will be here if people have more individual questions. We do have cookies left, so help yourself. And thank you everybody who's come out to support the board.